So I'm from Carnegie Mellon University. I am in the Engineering and Public Policy Department, and I'm going to tell you about some work that was interdisciplinary. I worked with people in the Sci Lab using the Privacy and Security Lab, as well as people in the Heinz College of Public Policy. The other co-authors on this paper are A.L. Pierre, who was at the time a postdoc and is now a professor in Israel, Laura Brandenmark, who at the time of the study was a grad student defending, is now a postdoc, Lori Craner, who is my advisor, and Alessandro Acquisti, who you are now familiar with. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. The goal of our work was to test different conditions that can impact disclosure, and in particular, disfluency. And I'm going to define this more as we go on. The method that we used was a series of surveys using human subjects. And our overall result is that all but one of our surveys showed non-significant results. The original work, which we were trying to replicate, used a different statistical test than we did, which I will talk about as well. And our conclusion is that we didn't find any evidence that disfluency impacts disclosure. So let me explain all of that a little bit better. Does this have timing on, perhaps? Is that why I would advance? Okay. So as we build privacy and security systems, we know that there are often points where the human has to make a decision. No matter how secure or private you build your code or you build your system, at some point, someone is going to make a decision that may impact the security. So the classic example is a very secure system, but someone writes their password on a sticky note and they put it on the computer. So there is a case where the human decision impacts the security of the system. And that's what our lab looks at a lot. So I was thinking about this, and I was looking at how humans make decisions. And there's this idea from psychology and human behavior decision making. Why is that advancing? Is that going to advance? Okay. Sorry? Okay. So the idea is that we have different ways of processing information and making decisions. We can be in the fast mode, where we make decisions quickly, instinctually, without thinking about it. Or it can be the slow mode, where we're much more deliberate, we think things through, and we take a little more time on our decisions before we make them. So you can manipulate these two different ways of thinking. There's a bunch of different manipulations. It's possessed. Actually, can I just? Yeah. There you go. And now slideshow.
Second.
Current slide. All right, that's one of those things where when you're up here, you don't see the right button, but when you're sitting in the back of the room, it's so obvious.
And that was fast thinking, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Before you go on, I'm sorry to have this definition of disfluency.
Yes, that's perfect timing, so let me tell you about that. So disfluency is a situation that creates cognitive load. So it's a situation that's a little bit difficult. So some examples are reading in a foreign language. So for me, that would be reading in just about any language I've studied except English. I would have to slow down and read carefully in order to understand what's going on. So that would put me into the slow, deliberate way of thinking. Another disfluent condition that has been studied is changing the font. So using a font that's more difficult to read. And I'm going to give you an example on the next slide. So one example of disfluency working is some researchers put a bunch of slides in a disfluent font in a real classroom, and they had regular fonts as well, and the same teachers taught the materials, and they found that the students who were shown the slides in the Disfluent font retained the information better. So it's pretty amazing that something like a font can make such a difference. As I talk about Disfluent fonts in our study, this is a basic example. The Disfluent is gray, it's in italics, it's a little smaller. It should be a little harder to read. And this is just the regular font. So when I talk about the control condition, you can imagine a font that looks something like this. So going back to this idea of how humans make privacy decisions and how they make security decisions, there are a lot of cases where people are asked to make decisions about how much information they're willing to share and what they're willing to disclose. So this is an example from LinkedIn about what information you're willing to make public. But it could also be something like social media. Maybe people should slow down and think before they make that post that they might actually regret in the future. What if all it took to help people make better decisions, to get them to slow down and think it through, was to change the font? That would be a pretty exciting finding. So we found some previous work supporting this idea that, in fact, that disfluency would, in fact, impact disclosure. This work was by Alter and Oppenheimer, so as I refer to Alter and Oppenheimer's original work throughout the rest of my talk, I'm referring to this work in particular.
Rebecca, there's a clicker.
A clicker, great. Do I need to turn it on too?
I don't know.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. So sorry for all these technological issues.
What was it that those guys did?
So yes, I'm gonna tell you exactly what they did and what we tried to replicate. But I do want to say from the beginning that our work we intended to build on this research. We found their work compelling. We thought it was true. We didn't initially set out to replicate or debunk it necessarily, but to use it as something that would help us validate our own manipulations and our own surveys. So what they did was they used a series of questionnaires that use a social desirability scale. So this is a 33-item questionnaire. It was developed by Crowd and Marlowe in 1960. It has been used many, many times in psychology as a measure of whether people admit to doing social desirable behaviors or not. So people can answer, agree or disagree with questions, such as, no matter who I'm talking to, I'm always a good listener. So this is an example of a socially desirable behavior. And if people agree with it, it means they are showing social desirable behavior, and this is considered low disclosure. And the questions are also in the opposite direction. So there have been occasions when I feel like smashing things. So to be socially desirable, you should disagree with this. So that would be, disagreeing with this would be socially desirable behavior. And once again, that would show low disclosure. So in the results, when there's a high social desirability score, that's actually a low disclosure rate. So let me show you the results that they published in their paper. They did their study on 13 Princeton undergraduates, and they actually did a 33-item version of the social desirability scale and a 10-item version of the social desirability scale. And they found that, in fact, in the disfluent condition, there were higher social desirability traits than in the control condition. And they found this for both the 33-item and the 10-item surveys. And importantly, they had a statistically significant p-value of 0.03, which is less than 0.05, which is the cutoff of what's statistically significant in this field. So this was, as I said, pretty compelling to us. I just want to give you an overview of what we did, because there's a number of different surveys and a number of different steps we took in order to figure out what was going on. So we did a web survey using both the social desirability scale and some new dependent variables. We attempted to replicate the Alter and Oppenheimer paper with just the social desirability scale using tablets with pen and paper, and then with their original pen and paper surveys. So I'll step through each of those one by one and tell you what happened. So for our online study, we had 4 dependent variables, the social desirability scale. The idea was we would be able to show the same thing that Alter and Oppenheimer had found, and that we could use that to make sure that our other manipulations were also working, were showing what we expected. And we had 3 other manipulations, testing or asking about unethical behaviors, asking sensitive questions, and asking about gift cards. So let me explain those to you. So for unethical behavior, we asked a series, yes.
Did you actually replicate this?
So this is not an exact replication. The first step, we were just trying to build on it. We were not replicating it exactly in the first step. We thought that we could put it online, use the same measure, the social desirability scale, as well as the different ones, and then we get the same effect, that we would find that Disfluent fonts did have an impact on disclosure, statistically significant. We expected that at least for the social desirability scale, as well as for other dependent variables.
But I'm just confused because
Yeah.
I thought you said you replicated it.
Yes.
Now, I'm not sure if you did what they did.
So I'm stepping through,
or
yeah.
if you modified something.
So I'm stepping through the results chronologically, how they happened in real life. So the first web study, it was not a real, it wasn't an exact replication. As we went through the study, it became more and more. We were finally using their exact materials and trying to use the same subject population and trying to replicate it exactly.
Oh, okay. So eventually you did do that.
Yes.
Right, okay.
So just to tell you a little bit more about our dependent variables, I have the citations. All of our dependent variables are based on previous work. So we asked people questions about unethical behavior with 3 different themes. So yes?
I'm sorry. If you exactly replicated their work, does that mean you got the same results that they did?
We did not. So let me take you, we did not get the same results as them. Right. So,
Better results?
no.
Well, I mean, the
Yep.
talk, right? What you're saying is, in some sense, not the word, it's the slide. So I'm just trying to spin myself out here.
Okay.
Can't predict the future.
Yeah. So, just to give a broader overview, so each of these steps were getting, basically we started off trying to build and extend their work, and then when that didn't work, we kept trying all these steps to get closer and closer to their work to find out, to exactly replicate it and find out why we weren't getting the same results as them. So I want to take you through these steps that we went through and explain them, and hopefully by the end, you'll be confident as we were with our results. So unethical behaviors are these questions where people could either say yes or no, or they prefer not to answer, where if they said yes, it was considered disclosure. So an example of a financial question would be, have you ever stolen more than $1,000? An example of an illegal question would be, have you ever tried LSD or ecstasy? And actually, the sexual questions make me blush, so I'm not going to give you an example. We also asked sensitive questions. So these were essay questions where people were asked to write a few sentences in response. And they were questions that could be personal in nature, such as describe the last time you were aroused. And we had 2 independent judges rate the results in terms of how much disclosure these essay questions resulted in. These judges were trained. We measured the inter-rater reliability between them, and they were high between 0.8 and 0.95. All right. And then we looked at gift cards. So we had 4 pairs of questions for both anonymous and identified gift cards. So the identified would have the cardholder name, some information about them. The idea being that if participants were willing to pay more for the anonymous gift card, that means they didn't want the information about their buying habits related to their name, that would be some sort of measure of willingness to pay for anonymity and privacy. So this survey was online using Amazon Inter. We had 388 participants in the end. So these are the good participants. We did include some control questions, such as, while watching TV, have you ever had a fatal heart attack? And if people said yes, we just eliminated all their responses. There were some other control questions in there as well, some paragraphs that you had to read and give the correct response to, just to make sure that people were really paying attention.
But that seems like kind of an unusual control question. What was your real purpose in asking a question like that?
To make sure that people were paying attention. So it's not a control in terms of like the control condition, but controlling that people were paying attention. So people get paid on Amazon Inter not very high amounts, usually between $2 and $3 an hour. So they're definitely incentivized to finish these surveys quickly. And we want to make sure that the people who were taking the survey were paying attention and reading the questions carefully and not just clicking through. The mean age was 35, so a little bit older than the typical university student population, a little bit older than the original Alter and Oppenheimer paper. So these are our results. For these, the gray Disfluent bar is actually how much disclosure. I talked about how in SES is actually the opposite, where a higher level means less disclosure. So the error bars are the standard deviation. And what you can see for the SES, the question on unethical behaviors, the 2 gift cards versus $15 gift card, $10 gift card question, and the essay questions, is that the results did tend to be within the standard deviation. And in fact, let's look at the p-values. So 0.91 is definitely greater than 0.05, so not statistically significant. Same for that. And you can't see it below, but it is 0.81. So when $15 gift card, 0.81, once again greater than 0.05. That one is 0.83. For this one, we got 0.04. So for the essay questions, we did get a statistically significant result, showing that Disfluent font did impact disclosure. So we were very curious about why this one was different than the rest. We ran it again, and we found that, in fact, we got another statistically significant result, but in the opposite direction, showing that Disfluent fonts increased disclosure. So, yes?
So I have a slide about this when I talk about particle physics tomorrow, but I'd like to know more about, you say the error bars are a standard deviation in this plot.
Yeah.
To me, when you have 2 things and the error bars mostly overlap,
Yeah.
the qualitative interpretation is you have no information that they're different from each other.
So exactly.
Is that not how I should be reading
That is
plot?
exactly. I actually paid him to say that. So that is exactly how you should be reading it. For all of these tests, except for these 2, but I mean, if you look at them, it's still questionable. The p-values and the bars indicate that really there's no difference between these 2 conditions. So if you remember back to the Alter and Oppenheimer paper, they did find a statistically significant difference between the conditions. So this is what you were getting to earlier, this is when we really started trying to drill down and figure out what was the difference between our survey and theirs. Why?
Their error bars as shown in your slide also overlapped.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm just going to interrupt you briefly as the moderator. So a few minor notes. Since this is a workshop and we don't all know each other yet, when everyone asks a question, if you can, at least the first time you ask a question, just say your name. And actually, every time you ask a question, that way, we get reinforcement of names. The second thing is, if you don't mind for the camera, repeating the question when it's, just so that,
Okay.
just so that, everyone can
Right.
And also for the people that might not have heard it.
All right. Is there a question I should repeat?
No,
Okay.
I think for now you're fine.
Okay, I'll try and do that. So we thought very hard about what the differences were between what we had done and what Alter and Oppenheimer had done. And you've probably come up with a lot of these already while I was talking. Our survey was online with anonymous participants. Their study was done in person on university students with pen and paper. And we had different participant pools. We had the slightly older MTurf group, and they had undergraduate students at Princeton. So we thought, well, we can replicate that. Let's go to our university center with some tablets and ask a bunch of undergraduates, and if a few graduate students are passing by, to take our survey on tablets. So we're asking them in person. And this time we're just going to do the SDS, what Alter and Oppenheimer did. A little over half females, average age 19 and a half, and our results are not statistically significant. So once again, we're finding we can't see any effect of disfluency on disclosure. Well, maybe it's because we did it on tablets. Maybe it's the fact that it's an electronic version versus pen and paper. So let's go ahead and try, we created a version of the social desirability scale on paper. This is the Disfluent version. It's meant to be hard to read, but you just get a basic idea that it's sort of a grid format. We had this in both the fluent and the disfluent condition. Once again, went back to the university center, a little over half female, average age 19 and a half again, and same results. If you can't see this and that, P 0.63, not a statistically significant difference between conditions. Okay, so really, what's going on? We sent an email to the original authors, and they were very kind, and they have been very helpful to us throughout this entire process. And they sent us their original materials, the surveys that they used. So this is their version of the survey. The big difference that you can see is that it's not a grid format, so it doesn't have those lines. We printed out their copies. We printed out the copies that they used. Take it back to the university center. They had both a 33-item social desirability scale and a 10-item version. Both of them we did about 60 undergraduates, which I can remind you is roughly twice than what they had done in their original paper. They had about 30. And guess what? Well, you can't see it, but p-value of 0.76 and p-value of 0.87, no statistically significant differences. Well, let's go back to the authors again, and let's ask them what they think the differences are, because we use the same participant pools, roughly the same. There shouldn't be that much of a difference between Princeton undergraduates and Carnegie Mellon undergraduates. We use their materials. What's going on? So sent them an email, and they were very helpful, and they sent us back their Excel spreadsheet with the original data from their results. So we looked at it closely. What could be different? Well, when we ran our statistical test, the independent t-test, on their data, we got an interesting result. Our p-values were not less than 0.05. We realized that if we ran a different statistical test, a paired t-test, that's when we got the p-values that they reported in their paper. So many of you are probably familiar with the difference between these two tests, but I'll just try and review them quickly anyway. I'm not a statistics teacher, so I hope I communicate everything clearly. In general, an independence t-test is used to measure the difference between two different subject pools. So we had our disfluent people and our fluent conditions, two different pools of people, and we measured the averages or the differences between these two different pools of participants. Typically, a paired t-test is used when you have the same people with same subjects with different values. So an example of this that I find makes a lot of sense to me is, for example, you have people run a distance, you see how long it takes, then you give them some drug, and you have those same people run the distance again, and you see what is the difference between their time. Did they go faster because of this drug or not? So is that difference statistically significant? So what they had done is they had run the paired t-test at the question level across all participants as opposed to at the participant level. So this is what I just tried to explain. I can come back to this for discussion, I think, particularly since the slides are kind of hard to read. So here's an overview of all the studies we did. The first two lines are the Alter and Oppenheimer results. And then the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 studies are the studies that we did. And to point out our p-values, except for our p-values are all greater than 0.05. So we didn't find any statistically significant difference except for the essay questions, which we ran twice, and we found that the results actually went in different directions each time we ran it. So even if you have issues with the fact that we used the independent samples t-test, and you think we should have used the paired t-test, we do want to point out that if we rerun all of our surveys with the paired t-test, in general, we do not get statistically significant values either, except for theirs and one that is 0.04, so just barely. And I do want to point out we didn't do any fund for any correction on these p-values. So, yeah. So it seems like there was some luck in the fact that they got these significant p-values. So what I would conclude, I have to be very careful about trying to say that we didn't prove the null hypothesis. We didn't prove that there's no difference. But at the same time, we didn't find any evidence that there's a difference that Disfluent font will affect disclosure. Just to remind you, we ran an online study with 388 participants. We ran a tablet study with 91 participants, and we ran the pen and paper version multiple times. And personally, I won't be relying on Disfluent fonts to get less disclosure. And I think the most important thing for this workshop is please be transparent about your statistical tests. I think if we'd known from the beginning that they had used a different statistical test, that would have saved us a lot of time, a lot of energy. We wouldn't have to have run this test multiple times. We could have discussed the question of statistics from the beginning. So, please, questions?
Thank you very much. And I know that some people are already beginning to ask questions, but in the interest of kind of making sure that we all feel engaged, I will do the little activity that I foreshadowed before, and then I'll open up a broader question, starting with you after that. But I would like the front row to turn to the row behind them, the next row to turn to the row behind them, and then the back, kind of pair amongst yourselves with the people on the side, and share. Each of you take a moment to share your question and the idea of new direction, and back and forth. And hopefully you'll meet someone new that you're not sitting next to, and then we will, take the broad questions. So introduce yourselves, and then. Good. Yeah. So we have a little different from what we thought, So if only one person's been talking so far, switch the speaker.
I tried
I'll see. Okay, so let's all come back as a group. And I guess, so once everyone's back together as a group, hopefully some more questions, ideas, discussions were generated, but I guess if you wouldn't mind, if you still have your question.
I do.
And just say your name again, please.
Ben Kukowski, University of Maryland. This is kind of like a learning theory question. Essentially, the two differences between the studies, one evaluated the difference between individuals and one by question. One of the things in learning theory that they notice is that when you put a human through an experiment, they start to adapt to the experiment and they learn through it. And so the intuition is like, if you read a computer science textbook, if you're unfortunate to do so, you go through the chapter, and it's in like Times New Roman. The very first block is pseudocode for particular algorithms in Fourier. And it may take you a minute or two to reread that block so you understand it. But as you go through the chapter, you kind of get better at doing it. And so the time it takes for you to internalize the concepts becomes much quicker the longer you go on. So possible, I guess the question is that how the length of the study actually affects the results between the two different.
Right. So to repeat the question, he was saying that people may, I hope I'm paraphrasing it correctly, people may adapt to the Disfluent font or to the regular font as they go through the survey. And how does the length of the survey impact our results? So thank you very much. That reminded me of something I forgot to mention. The longest survey, most of just the SDS were either 33 questions or 10 questions, so it took them only a few minutes to answer it. The longest survey was the MCHRC online survey, where we had each person do all 4 of those dependent variables, so it could take them up to 15 or 20 minutes. Well, we did a couple things to see if they were adapting or getting used to it. One thing, we randomized the order of the blocks. So some people saw the SDS first, some people saw the any of the other dependent variables, the sensitive questions first. And then we also randomized the questions within each of those blocks. And we looked to see if block order made a difference. And then for both the tablet, I think for actually all of them, we did have a question at the end asking people, did you find this hard to read? And that was something we did find a statistically significant difference between the conditions, where in the Disfluent font, people did find it harder to read the questions. So hopefully it has accounted for that issue, and hopefully the fact that the surveys were so short accounted for that as well. Yes.
So I've been told about a study at the USC gerontology school that's been coming up. I mean, I get these little tidbits. They send me an email saying, you know, things to do to help you not age. I'm at an age where I worry about aging, right? And they say, you know, use Disfluent font because it makes your brain engage more. They say, wear your watch upside down.
Right.
I just do time changes. I have no idea.
I wonder if why that was
I have no idea what time it is. Upside down West Coast time on the East Coast. But now, you know, I'd like to actually go back and ask them what their study basis is on. But I mean, I mean, this is a totally different question because, you know, your question was disclosure, not brain engagement. But.
So her question was about some other studies regarding Disfluent fonts and cognitive load that should help reduce aging. I mentioned the study on learning for Disfluent fonts. There's been a number of surveys about Disfluent conditions showing different things, such as affecting risk-taking, affecting how much people trusted online reviewers. There's a lot of different studies have showed that disfluent fonts have effects on other things, or disfluent conditions have effects on other things. Disclosure may be one of those things that's so personal, or maybe it's so variable, or maybe it's so contextual that maybe disfluent font is just not enough to get past all these other personal or situational differences. That, I mean, I don't have any proof of that. That's my hypothesis.
So I just passed Sam the mic, and then I'll get the next person too. But hopefully this means you won't have to repeat the question.
Okay, great.
Okay, this is Sam Weber, and I was wondering whether you tried to submit these results to a conference like SUPS, and if so, what was your experience?
So no, we didn't try and submit it to SUPS. There was a lot of debate about what to do with these results that are essentially null results. I'm not sure why we didn't consider SUPS. I think it was just this conference talked about replicability, and the issue that we found is that we couldn't replicate. It was much less, I think, yes. I don't know, it just seemed like this was more on topic.
Right. Well, we would hope so, but let's see if you had experience with other conferences saying, oh, negative results aren't publishable.
Right.
I mean, honestly, that was a huge debate because this was an interdisciplinary group that one of the postdocs looking for a job sort of wanted to, I hope I can say this, sort of wanted to resubmit it to the original psychology journal that's very well established, maybe write a letter to it. And there was some debate about, like, first of all, would they be interested in a null result? And second of all, what would that mean for this postdoc's career? Would it come out like he was attacking these very well-known and well-respected authors?
And raise your hand if you'd like to get next.
Okay, so I'm still trying to get a grip on all what happened. So, I'm sorry, I'm slow about this. Can you just briefly, and maybe in a couple of sentences, summarize the original study?
Okay.
Because if I've understood that correctly, then I have a question. If
Right.
I'm wrong about that, then I might not have a question.
So the original study used social desirability scale as a measure of disclosure. And they ran the survey with undergraduate students, and they found that disfluent font would result in people having higher social desirability scales, which they interpreted to mean less disclosure. We tried to run this and a number of other dependent variables, which we thought were perhaps better measures of disclosure, and we didn't find any statistically significant difference.
So it's the disclosure thing that I think I haven't
Yes.
really understood. So what does disclosure mean to the original guys?
So it means, so for the social desirability scale, and I think this is definitely an issue that we debated as well. So if you admit to doing things that aren't socially desirable, for example, having temper tantrums or not listening well, if you admit to it, then you're disclosing that you have these faults. So if you don't admit to it, not disclosure, but if you admit to it, then you're disclosing something. So that was their interpretation of the relationship between the social desirability scale and the disclosure results.
Okay, so the idea was then the disfluent font would make people read slower, maybe absorb the message a little more carefully, think more carefully about how they're going to respond, and the result is that they disclose less.
Right.
So they appear to be more socially desirable.
Right.
Okay, and in your study, you were trying to do the same thing, and you were looking for whether people were going to disclose information on things like Facebook, or
so this was just.
Was it more about security?
So this was much more about disclosure and privacy. So we were looking for, I mean, the big idea was if we can get people to slow down, if we can put them in one of these slow conditions, such as disfluency, and our hope had been to build, to not just use disfluency, but to use all these other different ways of getting people to slow down, such as making them wait, or to get people to go quickly, such as making them go fast. There's a bunch of different manipulations between slow and fast, and that had been our original goal. Do people disclose differently in these two different cognitive modes, these two different processes?
Okay, so
And so we started with disclosure. We started with disfluency.
I think I've understood. So my observation then would be that in the original study, the subjects were already familiar with the material, right? So people in general kind of know what it means to be socially desirable or undesirable. And it's at least plausible to me that if people slow down, right, and they're made to think a little bit harder about something about which they already have some intrinsic information, you could imagine that the slowdown would have some effect.
Right.
On the other hand, you know, when it comes to disclosure on Facebook and Twitter and all these other things, it's a little less clear to me that people already have the intrinsic information. So if they don't have that intrinsic sensibility, then it's not clear that slowing them down is going to make them think harder about something you don't already know about already. And maybe that would account for the disparity of the results.
Right. So we didn't actually do any like field tests on Facebook. This was a much more controlled condition.
The study, the tablets, the paper study 1, paper study 2 were asking the same questions that Adam and Oppenheimer asked,
Right.
except
Yes.
for the tools.
So
It was the same question.
the one of the blocks for the online study, the tablet study, the pen and paper, and the last two were all using exactly the same questions that the original study had used. So I'm not sure that intrinsic information or intrinsic ideas about what's socially acceptable or not, that's not a difference because it was the same questions. And in fact, in the last two studies, we didn't just use the same questions, but we used their formatted Word document. We used exactly what they had used.
Right, but we're talking about two different things here. So I accept what you just said, but I was actually talking about your study and not the replication of their study.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, now that you bring that point up, Carol, I mean, to me it sounds interesting what you found. I'm really not so sure why you couldn't publish it, right? I mean, no one has to be accusatory of the original authors. One only has to say, gee, you know, this is kind of surprising.
Okay, we have at least 2 more questions. And
I'm very much from Texas. I just want to know, did you record the time it takes for people to fill the questionnaire? Does that matter in all this? Just think more and answer, or they just quickly browse into it and finish it?
We did record the time, particularly for the two that were done electronically, the MTurk study and the tablet study. And since these were done a year and a half ago, I don't exactly remember the results. Yeah. Right. So what you would expect is that people in the disfluent condition would take longer to do the study, and this would be evidence that they were slowing down and reading it more carefully. You know, I just can't remember if we found a statistically significant difference in time or if there was a null result, or I just can't remember, so I don't want to say anything. I'd have to go back to the papers.
Just one quick remark. People who are doing surveys tend to reveal more information rather than somebody actually in conversation with you to do that.
Right. So the question is like, the fact that people reveal differently when it's face-to-face versus electronic communication. And that's why we went through those steps when we first started with this anonymous survey. And then we thought, well, if we ask them, if we take the tablet to them in person and ask them to fill out the survey, even if we're not looking over their shoulder, is that going to be different? And then there's also this other question of like what people reveal face-to-face, which is actually less our area of interest because we're very much interested in the decisions people make online or with the computer.
And another question? Or then,
Please, hang on just a second. Please be sure to repeat the question because some of the viewers are reporting that they can't hear.
Okay.
So this is Virginia. I had two questions / thoughts. One of them was that I've spoken to people who pretty much don't believe anything they read in journals anymore because they don't trust the statistics. And I sympathize a little bit, but I wondered, when you were able to get the raw data from the other experiments, you were able to do your own analysis, and then that's how you discovered what the issue was.
Right.
And do you have any thoughts about the importance or value of researchers making all their data available along with the paper so that people can check away or elaborate or such?
Right.
And
Okay, so the question is about making more information, all the raw data or the materials available so that people can replicate, because there are these concerns about replication. And I think, frankly, I'm really lucky to have had this happen early in my career because it's something I'm going to carry forward with me throughout my life. How to think about making things so that people can replicate them, how to organize my own studies so that if someone asks for that information, I can give it to them in an organized fashion. I would love to see more conferences and journals have a way to make that available. I know that some of them do. I would love to see that become more the norm because, as you said, there are these questions with replication.
so in that case, the replication was about the analysis, not about the experiment. That's the part that you weren't able to do because you didn't know.
Right.
So the other thing I was pondering was when you're starting to do these projects that are interdisciplinary, and you get these fears of, someone didn't want to publish this because they felt that they would be attacking the people that had done the experiment before, as opposed to adding new knowledge. And I'm wondering if you in your work that's interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary, what are your thoughts about that?
So I don't want to, okay, so she asked about this question of interdisciplinary work and where to publish and this issue of, I don't want to put too much emphasis on the idea that like we were attacking the original authors. They were super helpful to us throughout the process and answered all of our questions. And that was just one issue among many that we considered as we were thinking about where to publish. But I do think that definitely impacted the fact that we came to a conference like this that is not in the same domain as the original authors, because I think for my career, hopefully I'll be in sort of a computer science-y, engineering and public policy field. Those particular authors are not as big. So it may have had an impact. I don't want to overstate that though. I don't want it to seem like the big issue.
Great, so I've asked Felipe to go ahead and set up his laptop, but in the meantime, one final question.
So, of course, a big issue in design right now is the aesthetics of a font and the aesthetics that fonts have on the user experience.
Right.
Now, this is sort of a two-part question for you. I'm Nathaniel from Indiana University, by the way, so I forgot. The question I have sort of two parts. The first one is, how did you choose the font you chose to have a Disfluent experience? Would different fonts potentially have had a different effect? And the sort of follow-up is, my thought on that was, well, if you did it all in Comic Sans, could they not take it seriously and give you more information? Or
right.
Could that have had a significant, or could that eventually have a significant effect?
Can I answer that quickly? So the question was about how we chose the Disfluent font. So we did have this, huge literature of Disfluent fonts that we could build off of, in particular Alter and Oppenheimer's. We also did run a pre-survey in a Disfluent and Fluent font, not asking the social desirable questions, but just asking I forget exactly what we asked, but then we asked like, was this hard to read? How long did it take you? And we tested a number of different fonts to make sure what we were calling the Disfluent font, actually people felt it was Disfluent, hopefully without going so overboard that people just couldn't read it at all or just dismissed it. Exactly. And you had a second part of your question?
Yeah, the idea was if you thought, have you thought about using a font that might have people disclose more information?
Yeah. So I think actually Alessandro has done some interesting work on this. I hope I get it right. You can correct me if I don't. Where he had a website that was sort of kind of cheesy. It was like, I mean, it wasn't am I hot or not, but it was like, how hot are you? Versus one that was a more official looking university website. And he found that people actually disclosed more on the cheesy website. Is that correct? So we do know that the design, not just the typeset, not just the font, but the design of the overall website can have an impact on what people are willing to disclose.
Okay, so we're going to do a few things. First, let's thank Rebecca.